Welcome back to the channel. These stories are meant for late nights, quiet rooms, and headphones on. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin the first story. My name is Evan Calder, and this happened during my second year at university. I didn't plan to live off campus so early. Like most freshmen, I assumed housing would sort itself out if I just followed the system, but it didn't. By the end of my first year, every dorm slot was full, waitlists were frozen, and the few apartments near campus were either outrageously expensive or already claimed by seniors who knew how the game worked. I didn't. So I took what I could get. That's how I ended up in Ashwood Cooperative, a cluster of 3 converted houses sitting just far enough from campus that no one really wanted to live there, but close enough that students still considered it manageable. The rent was cheap, utilities were split, and nobody asked too many questions. At the time, that sounded perfect. Each house held about 10 residents. The buildings themselves had history. They'd once been part of a small roadside inn back in the 70s, then a halfway house, then eventually chopped up into student housing. Long hallways, individual room locks, shared bathrooms, the kind of place that always felt slightly too quiet, even when people were home. Most of us were students in our late teens or early 20s, a few grad students, a couple of former students who never quite left town. That alone wasn't strange. What was strange was Margaret. That wasn't her real name. It's just what everyone called her, though I never heard her introduce herself. She lived in one of the other houses, supposedly. I never saw her move in. She was just there, like she'd always been part of the place. Margaret looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s. Her hair was thin and gray, pulled back tightly, and she walked with a stiff, uneven gait, like her spine didn't bend the way it should anymore. Her clothes were always outdated. Heavy sweaters, long skirts, worn shoes that made a faint dragging sound when she walked. She never smiled. She never frowned either. Her face rested in this blank, unreadable expression that made it hard to tell what she was thinking, or if she was thinking at all. The first time I noticed her was in our kitchen's counter. That alone was odd. Each house had its own kitchen. There was no reason for residents to wander between them unless invited. Yet there she was, standing near the back counter while half a dozen of us cooked dinner, laughed, and argued over whose turn it was to clean. She wasn't cooking. She wasn't eating. She wasn't talking. She was just standing there, still, watching. At first, I assumed she was waiting for someone, but minutes passed, then longer. Nobody acknowledged her. Nobody asked who she was or what she needed. It was like she wasn't even there. I caught her staring at me, not glancing, not casually looking around, staring. Her eyes were fixed on my face, unblinking. When I shifted uncomfortably and looked away, the sensation didn't fade. I could still feel her attention like pressure against my skin. When I looked back, she was still watching me. I gave a polite half smile, the kind you give strangers when you don't know what else to do. She didn't react. No smile, no nod, nothing. Eventually, I left the kitchen early, appetite gone. That night, I chalked it up to awkwardness. Shared housing always came with weird personalities. That was the price of cheap rent. But then, she started showing up more. I'd see her standing in the hallway late at night, motionless, facing a wall like she'd forgotten why she was there, or sitting alone in the common room, lights off, hands folded in her lap. She never spoke to anyone, never asked questions, never explained herself. The moment that truly unsettled me happened about a week later. I was in my room working on a paper when I glanced out the window toward the street. That's when I saw her. Margaret was standing in the middle of the road, not on the sidewalk, not walking, just standing there, looking up at the house, at my window. It was cold that night, the kind of early fall chill that sinks into your bones. She wasn't wearing a coat. She didn't move when cars passed nearby, didn't flinch at headlights, just stood there, staring. I don't know why I did it. Maybe reflex, maybe nerves. I waved. The instant my hand lifted, Her entire body reacted. She jumped, literally bounced in place like a child who'd been surprised. Then she started hopping up and down, her movements jerky and frantic, like excitement had overtaken her completely. Then she ran. Not jogged, ran. She disappeared between the houses, her uneven gait somehow faster than it should have been. My stomach dropped. I hadn't just confirmed she was watching the house, I'd confirmed she was watching me, and now she knew exactly which room was mine. That night, I asked my housemate Dylan about her. "Oh, her?" he asked, barely looking up from his laptop. "Just ignore her." Ignore her. That was his entire explanation. When I pressed him, he shrugged and said that's what everyone did, that she'd always been around, that she wasn't dangerous, just weird. I didn't like that answer, so I kept asking. Eventually, someone from the neighboring house gave me a little more information. He said she wasn't a student, but she was connected to the property somehow, that she'd never hurt anyone, that people learned not to engage. That word stuck with me. Engage. As if attention itself was dangerous. After that, I tried to avoid her, but she didn't avoid me. I'd catch her outside my door late at night, standing there, silently, facing it. The first time it happened, I nearly collided with her when I stepped into the hallway. She didn't apologize, didn't react. She simply turned and walked away, slow and deliberate, like I was the one intruding. She started appearing in places they didn't belong, near the bathrooms, in stairways, at the end of hallways, just watching. Then my room key went missing. Each room in Ashwood had its own old-fashioned lock and key. Most people didn't bother locking their doors, but I always did. I couldn't sleep otherwise. When I realized my key was gone, panic set in. I tore my room apart looking for it, checked jackets, backpacks, pockets, nothing. I had to request a spare from the co-op office and pay to have a new copy made. I hated the idea that someone else might have access to my room. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound, a soft bump, then another, every 20 seconds or so. It was coming from my closet. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound came again, a soft, dull bump from inside the closet. Not loud enough to be accidental, not sharp enough to be a knock. It was muted, like something brushing against the door from the inside. I checked my phone, 2:17 a.m. My roommates were asleep. The house was quiet except for the hum of the old radiator and the faint noise of traffic outside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a pipe, maybe the building settling. These houses were ancient. They made noises all the time. But the sound came again. 20 seconds, almost exactly. That's when I realized something that made my chest tighten. The closet door wasn't loose. It didn't swing when the air shifted. It didn't rattle when someone walked by in the hallway. I knew that because I'd complained about it before. The hinges were stiff. You had to pull it open deliberately. The bump wasn't random. Something was touching it. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, then stopped myself. Light would make it obvious where I was, obvious that I was awake. I listened. Another bump. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, barefoot on the cold floor. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, in through my nose, out through my mouth. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't a kid. If someone was in my room, I needed to act. I stepped closer to the closet. The door was closed, all the way closed. I reached out, fingers brushing the handle. The metal felt colder than it should have. The bump came again, closer this time, harder. I didn't think, I reacted. I yanked the door open and screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, raw and uncontrolled, hoping to shock whatever was inside long enough for me to react. And there she was. Margaret was crouched inside my closet. She was wedged between my hanging clothes, knees pulled to her chest, her back pressed against the wall. One of my ties was loosely wrapped around her neck, like she'd been testing how it felt. Her eyes were wide and glassy, staring straight at me. In her right hand, she held a knife. A kitchen knife, one I recognized.
It was missing from our shared drawer downstairs. For half a second, neither of us moved. Then she lunged. She came at me faster than I expected, her frail frame moving with sudden, terrifying purpose. The knife arced toward my chest, clumsy but determined. I screamed again, not to scare her this time, but because my body was flooding with panic. I grabbed her wrist with both hands, twisting it away from me. The blade clattered to the floor. She was lighter than I thought, weak even, but she fought like an animal. She scratched my arms, bit my shoulder, kicked wildly, screaming incoherently, her voice high and broken. I shoved her backward and we both crashed into the wall, then down onto the floor. I pinned her as best I could, my knee pressed against her hip, one hand holding her wrists together. She writhed beneath me, surprisingly strong for someone her size, her face contorted with rage. I yelled for help, again and again. Doors slammed open in the hallway. Footsteps thundered toward my room. Someone flicked on the overhead light. Dylan was the first one in. He froze in the doorway when he saw us. "What the hell is happening?" I yelled back. "She was in my closet. She had a knife." Everything after that blurred together. Someone grabbed her arms. Someone else pulled me back. She kept screaming even as 4 grown adults restrained her, her voice echoing down the hall. Someone called the police. Someone handed me a towel when they noticed the blood on my arm. By the time the cops arrived, she had gone completely silent. They led her out in handcuffs, her face blank again like none of it had happened. She didn't look at me as they passed, not once. They found my missing room key in her pocket, along with 2 others. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The police questioned everyone, took statements, photographed the room, bagged the knife. They asked how she got access to the house, why no one had reported her earlier, why she was allowed to wander freely between buildings. No one had answers. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, the truth came out. Margaret wasn't a student. She wasn't faculty. She wasn't officially a resident at all. She was the property manager's sister. He had been letting her live in one of the unused rooms without registering her, without informing the co-op, without getting her medical or psychological care. She had a long history of severe mental illness, records, prior incidents, warnings. Instead of helping her, he hid her, let her roam, let her fixate, let her steal keys, let her escalate. He was arrested less than a month later. Negligence, endangerment, fraud. The list was long. Margaret was committed to a psychiatric facility. I never saw her again. I transferred out of Ashwood the following semester. People ask me if I'm angry at her. I'm not. I'm angry at the man who put her there, who decided convenience mattered more than safety, who turned a co-op housing cooperative into a trap. Because if I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't think I'd be here. I still lock my doors, still check my closet before bed. And sometimes, late at night when I hear a soft bump in the walls, I'm right back there again, listening, waiting. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint, sour edge in the air, like something damp that hadn't dried properly. I assumed it was the building. Old apartments always smelled a little off, especially in late summer when the heat lingered and the air barely moved. I had just moved in 3 days earlier. The place was a 3rd-floor walk-up in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of street that looked frozen in time. Same brick buildings, same crooked mailboxes, same porch lights that flickered but never fully died. The rent was cheap for the area, which should have been a warning, but I was 24 and broke and tired of couch surfing. The landlord, Mr. Hale, had seemed normal enough. Polite, soft-spoken. He showed me the unit himself, apologizing for the boxes stacked in the hallway and the locked door at the end. "That's storage," he said quickly when I glanced at it. "Old tenant stuff. I'll clear it out eventually." I didn't push. I needed the apartment more than I needed answers. The unit itself was small but clean. 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a living room with a single window that looked out over the alley. The walls were thin, but I'd lived with worse. At night, I could hear my upstairs neighbor pacing back and forth like they were counting steps. By the third night, the smell was stronger. It crept into my bedroom after midnight, subtle but persistent. I woke up with it in my nose, my throat dry, my head foggy. I checked the trash, empty. I checked the sink, clean. I even sniffed the vents like an idiot, convinced something had crawled in and died. Nothing. When I opened my bedroom door, the smell faded slightly. In the hallway, it was barely noticeable. That's when I realized it was strongest near the locked door at the end. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The door was old, painted over so many times the edges were rounded smooth. There was no handle, just a flat metal plate where one used to be. A padlock hung from a latch near the top. I bent down and sniffed. The smell was definitely coming from inside. I backed away uneasy and told myself it was exactly what Mr. Hale had said. Storage, old furniture, mold, rotting cardboard. It wasn't my problem. I went back to bed. At 2:38 a.m., something banged against the wall. I sat up instantly, heart racing. It wasn't loud, more like a dull thud, as if someone had dropped a heavy object in the apartment next door. A few seconds passed, then another thud, slightly closer. I listened carefully. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the other side of my bedroom wall, the one that backed up against the locked storage room. I lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Buildings made noise. Pipes knocked. People moved around at night. This was a city, not a graveyard. Still, I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I mentioned the smell to Mr. Hale when I passed him in the stairwell. "Oh, that," he said too quickly. "Yeah, that room hasn't been opened in years. Probably mildew. I'll have someone look at it." He smiled, but his eyes didn't meet mine. That should have bothered me more than it did. Over the next week, the noises became more frequent. Always at night, always after midnight. Sometimes it was a thud, sometimes a scraping sound like something being dragged slowly across concrete. Once I heard what sounded like coughing. That was the night I knocked on the door. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, frustration, sleep deprivation. Maybe I just wanted confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. I stood in the hallway at 1:12 a.m., my fist hovering inches from the wood. The smell was overwhelming now, thick and sour, making my eyes water. I knocked once. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. For a long moment, there was silence. Then something knocked back. 3 slow taps from the other side. My stomach dropped. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I stood there, frozen, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the landlord. I went back into my apartment and locked my door, telling myself it was a prank or a neighbor messing with me or pipes echoing in a way I didn't understand. The next morning, I noticed something new. A dark stain had begun to seep from under the locked door, spreading slowly across the hallway floor. And I knew, deep down, that whatever was inside that room wasn't just old furniture. I sat on my bed with the lights on, staring at my phone until the battery warning flashed red. Every few minutes, I found myself listening for sounds I couldn't explain. My apartment felt smaller than it had the day before, like the walls had inched closer while I wasn't looking. When morning finally came, the hallway smelled worse. I opened my door cautiously and stepped out, my shoes sticking slightly to the floor. The dark stain under the locked door had spread overnight, creeping outward in an uneven pattern. It wasn't liquid anymore. It had dried into something thick and tacky, with a faint metallic smell beneath the rot. I swallowed and forced myself to walk past it. I called Mr. Hale 3 times that morning. No answer. By noon, the sounds started again. This time, it wasn't a thud or a scrape. It was movement. Slow, deliberate movement, like someone shifting their weight just on the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. I heard breathing. Not loud, not labored, just steady, shallow breaths, as if whoever it was had learned to make as little noise as possible. I pulled away, shaking. That was when I noticed something else. The padlock on the storage door had been turned. I was certain it had been facing the other way before. I remembered the rusted shackle pointing down, the keyhole angled toward the wall. Now it faced outward. It hadn't fallen. Someone had touched it. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, they were polite but unconvinced. One of them tugged on the padlock, then glanced at the stain on the floor with mild irritation. "Looks like old water damage," he said. "Could be a burst pipe." I told them about the knocking, the breathing, the smell. They exchanged looks. "Anyone else have access to the room?" one asked. "Only the landlord," I said. They knocked on the door. No response. They shrugged, wrote something down, and told me to call again if I heard anything more concerning. When they left, the hallway felt quieter than before, like the building itself was holding its breath. That night, the knocking came back. It was louder this time, not against the wall, against the door. I lay in bed, frozen, counting each sound. One knock. Pause. Another. Then scraping, slow and uneven, like fingernails dragging across wood. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. After a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't move for hours. The next morning, Mr. Hale finally called me back. He sounded tired, irritated. "I told you that room isn't in use. I don't know what you think you heard, but I don't appreciate you calling the police." "There's something in there," I said, my voice cracked. "Something alive." Silence. Then quietly, "You shouldn't be listening so closely." The line went dead. I packed a bag. I didn't bother being careful. I threw clothes into my backpack, grabbed my laptop, my charger, my wallet. I told myself I'd stay with a friend, crash on a couch, deal with breaking the lease later. As I opened my door, I heard the lock click behind the storage room door. Not loud, just enough. I stood perfectly still. From the hallway came a sound I hadn't heard before. A voice. It was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Please." My legs felt weak. "I can hear you," the voice continued. "Don't leave." I stepped backward into my apartment and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. The voice didn't raise, it didn't plead louder, it just kept talking. "They said someone would come," it murmured. "They always say that." I slid down against the door, tears blurring my vision. "What do you want?" I whispered. There was a long pause. "Out." The police didn't come the second time. Dispatch told me to wait, told me units were busy, told me to stay inside. The voice grew weaker as the hours passed. Sometimes it stopped altogether. When it started again, it sounded farther away, like it was sinking. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke to the smell of smoke. It was faint at first, just enough to make my eyes sting. I jumped up and opened my door. The hallway was hazy. Smoke drifted from the storage room, curling up the walls in thin gray ribbons. The door was blackened around the edges. The padlock glowed faintly orange. Fire alarms screamed. I ran. Outside, firefighters were already arriving, their lights flashing red and blue against the brick. I watched from across the street as they forced the storage room door open. They carried someone out on a stretcher. The body was thin, emaciated, wrapped in scorched blankets. The face was unrecognizable. Mr. Hale was arrested that night. They found others. Not bodies, rooms. Hidden compartments, false walls, padlocked spaces built into buildings he owned across the city, some empty, some not. He'd rented to people like me for years, people who didn't ask questions, people who needed cheap rent and kept to themselves. The fire, they said, was likely intentional. Faulty wiring wouldn't have burned that fast. Someone wanted it destroyed. The official story blamed neglect. The rest never made the news. I moved out the next day. I still live in apartments. I still hear noises at night. But now, whenever I smell something sour in the air, something damp and wrong, I don't ignore it. I leave. Because some doors aren't meant to be locked, and some voices only get one chance to be heard.
My name is Logan, and this all happened during my second year of college. After freshman year, I didn't qualify for a dorm, so I ended up renting a room in a small off-campus housing complex. It was one of those old, converted Victorian homes divided into 3 units, all crammed onto a narrow street that hardly felt like it belonged in the city. The rent was cheap, the location inconvenient, but I had a bike, so I didn't mind the longer commute. Most of my neighbors were students, but there were a few older residents. Grad students, alumni, even a retired professor who seems to spend all his time in the library upstairs. But one resident immediately set my nerves on edge. She lived in the top unit of the house across the narrow alley. I never got her name at first. She looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s, with long gray hair pulled into a bun, and she walked with a pronounced limp. Her face was pale and expressionless like stone, and she never spoke to anyone. She didn't interact with the students renting rooms below her, and when she did appear outside, it was always in the shadows, always observing. The first encounter that made my stomach twist happened in the shared kitchen of my building. I had gone down to make dinner after a long day of classes. The smells of pasta sauce and burnt toast filled the room. As I stirred my noodles, I noticed her standing silently near the window, just watching. She wasn't cooking, eating, or even speaking. She didn't acknowledge anyone in the room. She just stood there, rigid and still, her eyes following every movement. When I looked directly at her, our eyes met for a moment. I swear she was staring only at me, not the others. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'm sure it wasn't. Later that week, I was studying in my room when I glanced out the window and froze. She was standing in the middle of the alley, staring straight at my window. The wind was cold and the street was empty except for her. I waved reflexively, a polite gesture, and she didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped slightly, like she'd been startled or excited, then turned and disappeared down the alley. My heart sank. That was the moment I realized she was not just quiet or private, she was watching me. I asked around. Most of my housemates shrugged, saying she'd always been around and that I should ignore her. One of them explained that she was supposedly connected to the university somehow, maybe retired faculty, though no one knew for sure. The vague explanation did nothing to ease the tight knot in my stomach. Something about her behavior didn't make sense, and the longer I lived there, the worse it got. Weeks passed and the incidents escalated. I would step out of my room only to nearly collide with her standing directly in front of my door. Late at night, I sometimes saw her creeping along the hallway of my building, her footsteps silent against the worn wooden floors. The moments weren't violent, but they were deliberate. She seems to be testing me, marking boundaries I hadn't agreed to. I started locking my door, but that didn't stop her from finding ways to make her presence felt. Then came the night I lost my room key. It wasn't catastrophic, but in a building like this, security felt fragile. I had to get another copy made, which was irritating but necessary. A few nights later, I woke up to a soft noise from the closet. At first, I assumed it was the house settling. Old Victorian homes always creak and groan. But this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Something or someone was shifting inside. I got out of bed slowly, heart hammering, and yanked the closet door open. She was crouched inside, one of my ties wrapped around her neck like a noose. In her hand, she held a kitchen knife, her eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed before I could even think. Her reaction was instant. She lunged. My scream was no longer performative. It was sheer terror. I grabbed her, wrestled her to the floor, disarmed her, and held her down. She kicked, scratched, and even bit me, her frail body belying the intensity of her attack. I yelled for help. Footsteps thundered down the hall, and my friend Ethan was the first to arrive. He helped me hold her down while another roommate called the police. The rest of the night became a blur. Officers arrived and arrested her immediately. She refused to speak the entire time.
Weeks later, we learned the truth. She wasn't connected to the university at all. She was the property manager's sister. He had secretly let her live there without telling anyone in one of the unoccupied rooms. Her mental health issues were severe, and instead of receiving proper care, she was hidden. The property manager was later arrested for negligence and other charges. Even with that explanation, I couldn't shake the fear. I still wonder why she targeted me. Maybe she reminded me of someone. Maybe it was random. Either way, that night could have ended far worse. I realized that I'd been lucky, terribly lucky. Years later, I still live in an apartment with thick locks and security cameras, but I carry the memory of that night like a scar. I'm more cautious now, hyper-aware of shadows and sounds that others ignore. And sometimes when I hear it creak in my closet, I can't help but check, just to make sure. A few months ago, after a messy breakup, I decided to take some time for myself. I packed my gear into my old backpack and drove into the mountains to camp alone. The fresh air, the isolation, the sound of water running in streams, I needed it. I parked at a small riverbend I had discovered years ago, somewhere off the map. It wasn't a designated campsite, but that was the point. No one else, no noise, no responsibilities. The first night was quiet. The rain began as a drizzle, nothing I couldn't handle, but as the evening deepened, I noticed 2 trucks parked near the trailhead, one gray, one white. No one was visible. My initial thought was to leave, but I reminded myself that the riverbend was long and whoever they were was likely far away. I continued to my campsite. About 15 minutes into my hike, I saw 2 men fishing on the riverbank, middle-aged, bulky, wearing work boots and thick jackets. When they saw me, one of them quickly covered something on the ground with his jacket. He called out casually, claiming he was just shooting cans. I didn't respond, just nodded and walked past. But the way he said it, fast, nervous, it didn't sit right. I finally set up camp behind a thick stand of trees, far enough from the river to feel hidden. The drizzle picked up, cold against my skin. I tried to relax, reminding myself I was here for solitude, for peace. That's when I saw the man again. He was across the river, watching. He waved, and against my better judgment, I waved back. He pulled something from his jacket. At first, I thought it was a phone. Then I realized it was a disposable camera. He snapped a photo of me and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. My heart raced. That wasn't normal. I went back to my tent, trying to convince myself it was harmless, but sleep didn't come. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps around my tent. My stomach knotted. I knew exactly who it was. I grabbed my handgun, something I always carried when camping alone, and unzipped the tent cautiously. There he was, half hidden behind a tree. His face was blank, unreadable, and in his left hand he held a small hatchet. I leveled the gun and commanded him to stop. He mumbled something about taking care of Ivan, his tone flat and emotionless. I fired a warning shot into the trees behind him. He dropped the hatchet and reluctantly followed my orders to empty his pockets. Once I was sure he was unarmed, I sent him off into the darkness, barefoot, so tracking him would be more difficult. I didn't wait to see if he left. I slipped through the forest, mud and rain making every step a struggle, until I reached the trailhead. The trucks were gone. The campsite looked empty. I drove home, still shaking, still processing. I called the local authorities, explained everything I could. Weeks later, there was no follow-up, no arrests, no reports. That night, lying in bed, I realized something crucial. No matter how far I ran, some people and some dangers could follow. You can't control what they want. You can only control how you react. And if I hadn't been prepared, if I hadn't carried that gun, the story could have ended far worse. After that night at the riverbend, I didn't return to the mountains alone. I stayed in my apartment, hyper-vigilant, replaying every detail over and over. Every snapped photo, every strange movement, every half glimpse of those 2 men on the river haunted me. Even weeks later, I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart hammering, convinced I had heard footsteps outside my window. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was wildlife, maybe it was neighbors, but deep down, I knew that what I'd encountered wasn't ordinary. Life settled into a tense rhythm. I avoided camping alone. I started carrying a small handgun whenever I went outside, even for mundane errands. I installed additional security cameras around my apartment, motion sensors, and even a small alarm that I could trigger silently from my bedroom. Every precaution became part of my daily life. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every unfamiliar sound, every shadow in my peripheral vision set my nerves on edge. One Friday evening, I decided I couldn't live in fear forever. I needed to face this. I needed to understand what I'd seen. I convinced my friend, Megan, to join me. She was level-headed, practical, and the kind of person who could help me think clearly when my anxiety was running high. We drove back out to the same river bend, this time together during daylight, to scout the area and see if there were any signs of the men's presence. The parking area was empty, the trucks gone. The river glistened under the afternoon sun, and the woods were peaceful. Too peaceful. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had overreacted, that the fear had been all in my head. But then we started walking along the riverbank, and I noticed the flattened grass near where I had set up camp. Footprints. Too many footprints for animals. They were human, large, and irregular, as if whoever had left them had moved quickly through the undergrowth, sometimes limping. Megan noticed them too. "Logan, these are recent," she said, crouching to examine the soil. "Someone's definitely been here." My stomach dropped. I told you, this isn't over. We decided to follow the trail carefully, staying close to the trees. After about 20 minutes, we found an area I hadn't noticed before, a small, hidden clearing surrounded by thick brambles. In the center was a crude wooden structure, almost like a shed, partially hidden under a tarp. Inside, I could see outlines of objects, boxes, crates, and what looked like camping gear. But there was also something else, a small portable generator with wires running to a pair of speakers. That explained the looped party sounds from the night I had snuck through Damon's basement, except this was worse. I crouched, studying the setup. Whoever had been here had built a full-scale deception. Sounds, movement, the illusion of presence, everything meant to trick someone into thinking the area was occupied, and judging by the footprints, they had been maintaining it recently. My pulse quickened. Whoever was responsible wasn't just hiding, they were planning, calculating. Too much patience. We didn't linger long. Megan and I retraced our steps, careful not to leave our own tracks exposed. Once back at the car, I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a one-off. The men, or the man, had a system. They had been watching, preparing, and most importantly, they had patience. Too much patience. The following week, I barely slept. I monitored the area with the cameras I had installed at home, but the riverbend was out of range. I debated involving law enforcement, but how could I explain what I'd found? There's a hidden base in the woods with recordings and traps, and I think someone is stalking me. It sounded insane, yet I couldn't ignore it. Then came the night that confirmed my worst fears. I was working late on my laptop when I noticed movement on one of my exterior cameras. At first, it looked like a raccoon or a stray dog, but then I froze. It wasn't an animal. A figure, large and dark, moved slowly along the perimeter of my property. I could just make out the shape of a hatchet in its hand, glinting in the faint moonlight. My blood ran cold. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and waited. Whoever it was stopped briefly, crouched low, then disappeared behind the shrubs. I didn't see them again that night, but the message was clear. They knew where I lived. They had tracked me. I spent the next few days planning. I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. I set traps, tripwires with bells, motion-sensitive lights, and reinforced doors and windows. I even brought Megan back in, using her presence as a second set of eyes. The next night, we waited in silence. Hours passed, nothing. The tension was unbearable, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Around 2:30 a.m., a shadow moved along the fence line. I flicked on the lights and aimed my gun. Two figures emerged, not one, but two. The larger one held a hatchet, the smaller one carried a backpack that rustled unnaturally as they moved. Both were masked in dark clothing, gloves covering their hands. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stayed calm, breathing steadily. I shouted, "Stop, police are on the way." They froze, hesitation clear. Then the smaller one bolted towards the woods. The larger one turned towards me, gripping the hatchet. I fired a warning shot, and he stumbled back, startled. Megan screamed, and that snap of panic was all the figure needed to retreat into the darkness. We didn't chase. There was no reason to. They knew the terrain better than we did. By morning, police were involved. Megan and I provided every detail we could: the footprints, the hidden structure, the cameras, the initial incident at the riverbend. Officers returned a week later with search warrants. They found a series of hidden bunkers in the woods, all connected by narrow trails and filled with surveillance equipment, supplies, and disturbing personal notes referencing me. There were maps with my house circled, photographs of my apartment, and even diagrams showing escape routes. Whoever was doing this was methodical, meticulous, and obsessed. 2 men were arrested, brothers in their early 30s, transient workers who had a history of minor offenses, but nothing violent. Investigators were shocked by the level of preparation, the planning, and the psychological games they had played. They had been living off-grid in those bunkers, waiting for the right time, waiting for me. I learned something crucial during the investigation. They had been watching my apartment, tracking my routines, testing my reactions. The riverbend was the first phase. The disguised party and the camera snapshots were psychological trials meant to gauge my responses. When I reacted, they learned my limits. I was lucky. I survived, but the realization that someone could monitor my life so closely undetected shook me deeply. I moved a few months later to a gated community several hours away. I still carry my firearm, but I also carry a new sense of vigilance. I never camp alone anymore. I rarely stay out past dark. Even now, when I hear rustling in the bushes or the faint click of a camera, I flinch. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be free of the paranoia. And I'm certain that's exactly what they wanted, to instill fear, to make me question every shadow. Logan, my name, survivor, still shaken. I tell this story now not to frighten, but to warn. There are people in the world who watch, who wait, who calculate. And sometimes no amount of preparation feels enough. You have to trust your instincts, act decisively, and never underestimate the lengths someone can go to. Because when obsession meets patience, the consequences can be terrifyingly real.